The coldest men aren't the ones who hate people. They're the ones who stopped believing anyone could be trusted. Adrian Romano signed the termination letter without reading the final page. The silver pen moved across the paper with practiced precision, and the woman sitting across from his desk knew better than to argue. She gathered her purse with shaking hands, whispered a quiet apology, and hurried out of the office without waiting for a response. The door clicked shut behind her, and silence flooded the room again. Adrian leaned back in his leather chair and stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Manhattan. 32 floors below, traffic crawled through the rain like veins of red and white light. Inside the office, everything was controlled. The temperature, the lighting, the schedule, the distance between him and every other human being. He preferred it that way. In the last 12 months, he had gone through 12 executive assistants. One had leaked information to a rival corporation. Another had accepted money from a tabloid reporter. The rest had lied about smaller things, expenses, phone calls, meetings, promises they never intended to keep. Adrian had stopped being surprised. "Everyone lies eventually," he said quietly, almost to himself. His head of security, Marcus Hale, stood near the door with a tablet in his hand. At 6'4", Marcus looked more like a retired linebacker than a corporate security chief, but his expression remained unreadable. "Human Resources has another candidate waiting downstairs," he said. "Clara Bennett, 27, former accounting student. Strong references from 2 financial firms." Adrian reached for the next folder and flipped it open. A passport-style photo showed a woman with soft brown curls, clear eyes, and the kind of expression that didn't seem practiced. No heavy makeup, no forced smile, no attempt to look impressive. That alone made him suspicious. "Send her home," he said. "I'm not hiring anyone today." Marcus nodded once and touched the earpiece hidden beneath his collar. Before he could speak, the elevator outside the private office chimed. Both men looked toward the frosted glass entrance. A second later, the outer door opened, followed by hesitant footsteps. Adrian's jaw tightened. No one reached this floor without authorization. The inner door opened slowly, and a woman stepped inside, clutching a navy portfolio against her chest. She wore a simple charcoal coat dampened by the rain, and a few curls had escaped the loose clip at the back of her head. The moment she realized where she was, she stopped. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the office. The dark wood, the city skyline, the man behind the desk, and the security chief already moving toward her. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. "I think I got off on the wrong floor." Marcus reached the door in 3 long strides, but Adrian lifted a hand. The gesture was small, yet it stopped the larger man instantly. Clara looked from Marcus to Adrian, clearly trying to decide whether she should back away or explain herself. Most people became nervous under Adrian Romano's attention. They looked at the floor, filled the silence with excuses, or tried too hard to appear confident. Clara Bennett did none of those things. She looked embarrassed, but she stayed still and met his eyes for exactly 1 second before speaking again. "The elevator skipped the 21st floor," she said. "I was looking for Human Resources. I didn't mean to interrupt anything." Her voice was steady, not fearless. He could hear the tension underneath, but controlled. Adrian studied her for a long moment. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere behind him, the city moved through another gray afternoon, but the office felt strangely still. "What position were you applying for?" he asked. Clara blinked, as if she hadn't expected the question. "Administrative assistant, sir." "And if I told you this wasn't Human Resources?" A faint flush rose in her cheeks. "I'd believe you immediately." The corner of Marcus's mouth twitched before he hid it again. Adrian noticed. More importantly, he noticed that Clara hadn't tried to flatter him, hadn't pretended she recognized him, and hadn't offered the nervous speech people usually gave when they found themselves in the wrong room with a powerful man. She had simply told the truth. For the first time in years, Adrian found himself looking at a stranger and wondering not what she wanted from him, but why she seemed to want nothing at all. And that question was far more dangerous than suspicion. Clara Bennett had spent the entire subway ride downtown rehearsing answers that no longer mattered. She sat near the back of the nearly empty train, her navy portfolio resting on her knees, while rain streaked across the windows and blurred the tunnels into ribbons of gray. Administrative experience. Intermediate Excel. Basic bookkeeping. Available immediately. Those were the safe answers, the ones that fit neatly onto an application form. The real story was messier. 3 years earlier, Clara had been a junior at Fordham University studying accounting. Her professors had described her as the kind of student who stayed after class to ask questions no one else thought to ask. She had loved numbers because they followed rules. Assets equaled liabilities plus equity. Debits had credits. If something did not balance, there was a reason. Then her mother collapsed during a shift at a grocery store in Queens, and the rules stopped working. Congestive heart failure, mounting medical bills, and a recovery that stretched from weeks into months forced Clara to leave school halfway through the semester. She told herself it was temporary. She would work for a year, save money, and return. A year became 2, and 2 became 3. She worked wherever she could find a paycheck. A dental office, a shipping warehouse, a small insurance agency where the owner paid late, so often that employees kept spreadsheets tracking which pay periods had actually arrived. At night, she managed her mother's medications, argued with insurance representatives, and tried not to calculate how quickly their savings were disappearing. By the time a former coworker mentioned an opening at Romano Holdings, Clara had exactly $83 left in her checking account and a utility notice folded inside her wallet. The building itself looked less like a corporate headquarters and more like a luxury hotel, all black marble, brushed steel, and quiet that seemed expensive. She had arrived 20 minutes early, smoothed the wrinkles from her blouse in the restroom mirror, and repeated one promise to herself. Do not sound desperate. Desperate people were easy to dismiss. The receptionist had given her a visitor badge and pointed her toward the elevators. Floor 21, Human Resources. Simple. Except the elevator had not stopped at 21. It had climbed higher, opened onto a silent private floor, and delivered her directly into the office of a man whose name she had only seen on financial news headlines. Now, standing in that office with rainwater drying on her coat, Clara became painfully aware of how out of place she looked. Adrian Romano's desk was larger than the kitchen table in her apartment. The city stretched behind him like a kingdom of glass and steel, and he sat in the middle of it with the stillness of someone completely accustomed to being obeyed. Marcus remained near the door, watchful but no longer threatening. Adrian closed the folder containing her application and rested one hand on top of it. You studied accounting, he said. Clara nodded. Yes, sir. I completed 3 years before I had to leave school. Had to? The question was not unkind, but it was direct. My mother got sick, she answered. I became her primary caregiver. Most interviewers responded to that with sympathy, which usually meant the conversation was already over. Adrian did not react at all. Why apply for an administrative position instead of returning to accounting? Clara hesitated. Honesty had not always served her well, but she was too tired to invent a better version of her life. Because accounting jobs usually require a completed degree, and hospitals do not pause their billing cycle while you finish college. The words came out flatter than she intended. She saw Marcus glance down, hiding what might have been a reaction. Adrian's expression remained unreadable, yet his attention sharpened. You speak like someone who has spent time arguing with insurance companies. I have spent hundreds of hours arguing with insurance companies. And did you win? A small breath of laughter escaped before she could stop it. Sometimes. Mostly I learned which departments transfer you in circles and which supervisors will actually listen if you have the policy number ready. For the first time, something almost human flickered across Adrian's face. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one. He opened her portfolio, scanning the neatly organized resumes, reference letters, and handwritten notes she had prepared. Everything was labeled. Everything was in order. The kind of order created by someone trying very hard to keep a difficult life from falling apart. You are not what I expected, he said quietly. Clara tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. With respect, sir, You are not what I expected either. The room went still again. Then Adrian leaned back in his chair and looked at Marcus without taking his eyes off Clara. Cancel the rest of my afternoon meetings, he said. I think I want to conduct this interview myself. Clara remained seated across from Adrian Romano's desk, while Marcus quietly left the office and closed the door behind him. The soft click sounded far louder than it should have. She suddenly realized she was alone with a man who appeared regularly on business channels. A man whose companies owned half the buildings she passed on her subway ride home, and she had just told him he was not what she expected. Adrian stood and walked toward the windows, his hands in the pockets of his charcoal trousers. Up close, she could see the faint outline of tattoos disappearing beneath the cuff of his white dress shirt, dark ink against pale skin. He stopped with his back to her, looking down at the rain-slick streets 32 stories below. Tell me what you expected, he said. Clara's first instinct was to apologize, but something about his tone stopped her. He sounded curious, not offended. Honestly, I would prefer that. She drew a slow breath. I expected someone surrounded by assistants, lawyers, and people answering questions for him. I did not expect the head of the company to interview a candidate himself. Adrian turned slightly, one eyebrow lifting. And now that you have met me, I think you notice more than people realize. His gaze held hers for a moment before he returned to the desk. Instead of sitting immediately, he picked up a financial report from the corner of the polished mahogany surface and placed it in front of her. Humor me, he said. Page 4. Clara glanced down. Revenue projections, operating expenses, acquisition costs. The numbers were clean, professionally formatted, and intentionally wrong. 1% had been shifted by a decimal point, turning a modest growth estimate into something impossible. It was the kind of mistake a nervous applicant might overlook. Adrian sat down across from her, watching in silence. What do you see? He asked. Clara traced the figures with her eyes again. This was not an administrative test. He was testing whether she would pretend to understand, whether she would agree with whatever he said simply because of who he was. She looked up. The operating margin is overstated by 9%. Adrian's expression did not change. Is it? Yes, sir. The acquisition cost on the previous page is listed at $42 million, but the margin calculation uses $4.2 million. The decimal is in the wrong place. Silence settled between them. The rain tapped softly against the windows while the city blurred behind Adrian's shoulders. Most candidates would have rushed to fill that silence. Clara forced herself to stay still. Finally, Adrian asked, You found that in less than 30 seconds? I spent 3 years training my brain to look for numbers that do not belong. And if I told you the report came from my chief financial officer, then I would assume he made a mistake, not that math stopped working. For the first time, Adrian's mouth curved into a faint, genuine smile. It transformed his face in a way that was almost unsettling, because it revealed how rarely he used the expression. You are either very confident, he said, or you have not realized how dangerous it is to correct people in this building. Clara felt the weight of the question. She could back down, soften the answer, become agreeable. That was what she usually did in interviews. But she had spent too many nights fighting insurance denials and balancing overdue bills to pretend she believed confidence was the same thing as disrespect. I am careful, she said quietly. But if you are asking me to look at numbers, I assume you want the truth. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as if he were reading something written beneath her words. Why did you really leave school? The question caught her off guard. I told you, my mother got sick. That is the reason. It is not the whole story. Clara looked down at her hands. The skin around her knuckles was dry from constant washing and handling paperwork. When my mother came home from the hospital, she could not climb the stairs to our apartment by herself. I was taking classes during the day, working evenings, and sleeping maybe 4 hours a night. One morning I fell asleep on the subway and missed an exam that was worth 30% of my grade. Her voice remained steady, but she could still remember the humiliation of that email from her professor. I realized I could either keep pretending I could do everything or I could make sure my mother had someone at home who was awake enough to help her. Adrian said nothing for several seconds. Then he asked the question that mattered most. If I hired you, why should I trust you? Clara met his eyes directly. You should not. He went completely still. Trust is not something you give a stranger because she has a neat resume, she continued. It is something she earns by being consistent when nobody is watching. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Adrian Romano had spent years hearing people promise loyalty, honesty, and discretion within the first 5 minutes of meeting him. Clara Bennett was the first person who had looked him in the eye and told him he had no reason to trust her yet. And somehow that answer made him want to. Clara did not hear from Romano Holdings for 3 days, and by the 4th morning she was convinced the interview had become an interesting story Adrian Romano would forget by lunch. She was updating invoices at a temporary clerical job in Long Island City when her phone buzzed with an unknown Manhattan number. Ms. Bennett, a calm female voice asked. This is Evelyn from Romano Holdings. Mr. Romano would like you to start Monday morning at 8 o'clock. Clara stared at the computer screen, certain she had misheard. I am sorry. Could you repeat that? You have been hired as executive administrative assistant to the office of the CEO. A car will pick you up at 7:15. This is a temporary assignment for 30 days, Evelyn explained. Mr. Romano wants to evaluate whether you can handle the executive floor before making it permanent. The call ended with professional efficiency, leaving Clara sitting motionless while fluorescent lights hummed overhead and her coworker argued with a printer across the room. Executive assistant. Not the entry-level administrative position she had applied for. Not a shared support desk on the 21st floor. She thought about calling back to correct the mistake, but another thought arrived first. The overdue electric bill sitting on her kitchen counter. Monday morning, a black sedan stopped in front of her apartment building at exactly 7:15. Clara almost laughed when the driver stepped out and opened the rear door for her. She had spent years taking the subway with grocery bags and medical supplies balanced on her knees. Now she was being driven through Midtown like someone important. The headquarters looked even more intimidating in daylight. Marble floors reflected the chandeliers above. Security gates opened with a quiet electronic hum, and employees in tailored suits moved through the lobby with the purposeful speed of people who believed every minute mattered. Evelyn, a silver-haired woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and perfect posture, greeted Clara near the elevators. You are the one who wandered onto the private floor, she said, not unkindly. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was hoping that story had not traveled. In this building, everything travels. The question is whether it survives the day. She handed Clara a slim folder and lowered her voice slightly. A piece of advice. Mr. Romano notices details. He notices when meetings start 30 seconds late, when numbers are rounded instead of calculated, and when someone says they completed a task they have only started. Do not try to impress him. Accuracy impresses him. The private elevator opened directly into the executive floor, and the atmosphere changed the moment Clara stepped out. The noise of the city disappeared behind thick walls and soft carpeting. Frosted glass offices lined the corridor, but Adrian's office sat at the far end behind dark wood doors that remained closed. Employees spoke quietly here, as if they were in a library rather than a corporate headquarters. Clara's desk was positioned outside the CEO's office with a clear view of the corridor. 2 monitors, a multi-line phone system, a color-coded calendar already filled with meetings, and a stack of briefing binders waited for her. She had barely sat down when a man in an expensive navy suit approached. New assistant? He asked with a polished smile. Clara Bennett. Daniel Mercer, Chief Operations Officer. His handshake was firm, but his eyes assessed her the way executives evaluate a new vendor. You should know Adrian burns through assistants faster than I burn through airport coffee. If you make it 6 weeks, I will be impressed. Before Clara could respond, the office doors opened. Adrian stepped out, already dressed for the day in a charcoal suit and black tie. His dark hair still slightly damp as if he had arrived straight from an early workout. Conversations in the corridor stopped without anyone being told to stop. He looked at Clara for one brief moment. Inside, he said. The office was as imposing as she remembered, but now she noticed the signs of someone who practically lived there. A jacket draped over a chair, financial reports spread across a side table, and a coffee cup that had clearly been reheated more than once. Adrian handed her a tablet. Your first task is simple. Review today's schedule and tell me which meeting should be cancelled. Clara scanned the calendar. Investor call, acquisition review, legal briefing, charity board luncheon, and a 90-minute internal strategy session scheduled directly before a flight to Chicago. The strategy session would make him late for the airport by at least 20 minutes even. If every previous meeting ended on time, which calendars almost never did. The strategy session, she said. Move it to tomorrow morning. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? Because your driver is scheduled to leave for the airport at 4:10, and this meeting ends at 4. The airport is 30 miles away, and midtown traffic at that hour is unpredictable. You built a schedule that assumes Manhattan will cooperate. A beat of silence passed. Then Adrian nodded once. Reschedule it. Clara stepped back into the outer office with the tablet in her hands, trying not to show how fast her heart was beating. Behind her, Adrian returned to his desk without another word. But as she sat down and began reorganizing the afternoon calendar, she became aware of something unusual. Through the open doorway, she could feel his attention on her. Not constant, not obvious, but present. Like a man who had spent years expecting deception and had just found someone he could not quite categorize. By the end of her first week, Clara had learned that Adrian Romano ran his company the way some people conducted military operations. Every meeting had a precise objective, every report had a deadline, and every employee understood that almost correct was simply another way of saying wrong. What unsettled her was not his strictness. It was the fact that he seemed to function without rest. He arrived before 7 every morning. He stayed long after the executive floor had emptied. More than once, Clara had left at 6:30 only to find the light still glowing beneath his office door. On Thursday evening, she returned from delivering signed documents to legal and noticed the floor was nearly silent. The cleaning crew had not arrived yet, and the city outside the windows had dissolved into a wash of blue-gray rain and scattered headlights. Adrian's office door was slightly open. Through the gap, she could see him sitting at the conference table rather than behind his desk. His jacket had been tossed over a chair, his tie loosened, and one hand pressed against his temple while spreadsheets covered the table in front of him. For the first time since meeting him, he looked less like a powerful executive and more like a man carrying something too heavy for one person to hold. Clara started to walk past, then stopped. Evelyn's warning echoed in her mind. Do not try to impress him. Accuracy impresses him. This was not a task, and she had no right to interfere. Still, she remembered the dozens of nights she had found her mother sitting awake at 2 in the morning, pretending she was not in pain because she did not want to worry her daughter. Exhaustion had a look, and Adrian was wearing it. She walked quietly to the small break room at the end of the corridor. The coffee pot had been sitting on the warmer for hours, but there was a fresh bag of beans in the cabinet. 10 minutes later, she carried a clean mug back down the hallway along with 2 aspirin packets she kept in her purse for headaches. She set them on the edge of the conference table without stepping fully into the room. You are still here, Adrian said without looking up. So are you. He finally raised his head. The sharpness in his eyes was muted by fatigue, but it was still there. Most employees would have left 30 minutes ago. Most employees are probably smarter than I am. A faint huff of amusement escaped him. Clara nodded toward the papers. You have been staring at the same page since I walked by the first time. You were watching me? I was walking to legal. It is difficult not to notice the only illuminated office on the floor. Adrian glanced at the coffee, then at the aspirin. I did not ask for this. I know. She turned to leave, already regretting the impulse, but his voice stopped her. Why bring it, then? Clara looked back over her shoulder. Because headaches make people careless, and you do not seem like someone who can afford careless mistakes." For a moment neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows, and somewhere far below a siren faded into the distance. Adrian picked up the mug and took a cautious sip. "This is not the burnt coffee from the break room." "No, sir. I made a fresh pot. You know I could have had an assistant do that." "You do have an assistant. That is literally my job." The corner of his mouth lifted. Again, that rare, almost smile she had seen during the interview. It vanished quickly, but not before she noticed it. Adrian studied her over the rim of the mug. "You did not leave a note." "Should I have?" "Most people would want credit." Clara thought about the years she had spent caring for her mother. The medications sorted into plastic containers, the meals prepared before dawn, the insurance calls no one ever saw. When someone is helping because they want applause, they usually make sure their name is attached to it. Something shifted in his expression then, subtle but unmistakable. The guarded distance remained, yet curiosity had begun to replace suspicion. He set the mug down carefully. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her first name. "Yes. The coffee is exactly right." She gave a small nod and left the office before he could say anything else. Back at her desk, she opened her bag and realized she had given him the last aspirin she had. It did not matter. What mattered was the strange feeling that lingered as she looked toward the partially open office door. She had expected fear, pressure, maybe admiration for a powerful man. She had not expected the quiet pull of wanting to make his impossible day a little easier. Inside the office, Adrian remained seated at the conference table long after Clara had returned to her desk. The spreadsheets were still waiting, the deadlines were still real, but his attention kept drifting to the fresh coffee and the absence of a thank you note. In a world where everyone seemed to want something from him, a woman had just done something kind and walked away before he could repay her for it. And Adrian Romano did not know what to do with that. Friday morning began with a problem. Clara knew it before she even reached her desk. The executive floor was too quiet, the kind of silence that meant people were speaking in other rooms with the doors closed. Evelyn stood beside the reception area holding a tablet, her expression tighter than usual. "The Zurich acquisition files are missing," she said as Clara approached. "The signed originals?" Clara asked. Evelyn nodded. "They were in the secure records cabinet last night. This morning the folder is gone." A cold feeling settled in Clara's stomach. Those documents represented months of negotiations and tens of millions of dollars in contracts. Losing them was not the kind of mistake that could be fixed with an apology and a reprint request. Before Clara could ask anything else, Adrian's office door opened. "Inside," he said. The single word carried through the corridor like a command. Clara followed Evelyn into the office and found Daniel Mercer already there, standing near the conference table with his arms crossed. Adrian remained behind his desk, one hand resting on the missing files inventory sheet. The fatigue she had seen the night before was gone, replaced by the controlled stillness that seemed to make everyone else breathe more carefully. "The cabinet was accessed at 7:12 this morning," he said. "Only 4 people had authorization. Daniel, Evelyn, the records manager, and my assistant." His gaze moved to Clara on the last word. She felt the weight of it immediately. Not an accusation, not yet, but the acknowledgement that she was part of the list. Daniel spoke first. "I arrived at 7:25. The cabinet was already open." "And you did not think that was worth reporting immediately?" Adrian asked. "I was trying to determine whether the file had been moved for copying." Evelyn shook her head. "Nothing was scheduled for copying. I checked with records." Adrian turned to Clara. "Where were you between 7 and 7:30? "In the lobby until 7:18. Security can confirm that. I came upstairs, stopped at the break room, and reached my desk at 7:24. "Did you access the cabinet?" "No," the room fell silent. Clara could feel Daniel watching her, and for one uneasy second she understood how quickly suspicion could become a verdict in places like this. She could defend herself aggressively, point out that she had only been employed for a week, insist that she had no reason to steal anything. But desperation often sounded guilty. Adrian's eyes remained fixed on her. "If I review the security footage," he said, "what will I see?" Clara answered without hesitation. "You will see me carrying a coffee cup and my purse. And you will see that I never walk near the records cabinet." Daniel exhaled sharply. Anyone could say that. Clara turned toward him. "Then let the footage decide." Daniel's expression hardened. "You seem remarkably calm for someone under suspicion. Because I know whether I took the file." The answer came out steadier than she felt. Adrian watched the exchange with unreadable focus. "There is another possibility," Clara said carefully. "The file was not taken by someone trying to steal it. It may have been taken by someone who believed they could return it before anyone noticed." Daniel frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" Clara looked back at Adrian. "When people steal confidential information, they usually avoid triggering an inventory alert. But the cabinet was left open. That feels less like a planned theft and more like someone was interrupted or in a hurry." Adrian tapped the inventory sheet once with his finger. "Go on." "The access log records the cabinet opening, but not the physical key removal. If someone used the cabinet regularly, they would know that. They might assume they could borrow the file for a few minutes, copy one document, and put everything back before the morning review." Daniel's voice sharpened. "You are making a lot of assumptions for someone who has been here 5 days." Clara met his gaze evenly. "I am looking at the details you already have." Adrian stood and walked to the windows, his reflection dark against the rainy skyline. "Security is reviewing the footage now," he said. "Until we have answers, no one leaves this floor." The words settled over the room like a locked door. Clara felt her pulse climb despite her effort to stay composed. She thought of her mother waiting for a pharmacy pickup that afternoon, of the fragile new job she could not afford to lose, and of how quickly trust could disappear when money and confidential information were involved. Adrian turned back from the windows, his expression impossible to read. "Clara," he said quietly, "if you remember anything unusual from this morning, I want to hear it immediately." She nodded once. "I will." But as she stood there under the gaze of the most guarded man she had ever met, Clara realized something had changed. A week ago she had been a stranger who wandered onto the wrong floor. Now Adrian Romano was looking at her as one of a very small number of people who might either betray him or help him uncover the truth, and she was not sure which possibility frightened her more. The waiting was the worst part. The executive floor remained under a quiet lockdown while security reviewed footage from every hallway, elevator, and entrance. Phones still rang, meetings were still postponed, and assistants still answered emails. But the normal rhythm of Romano Holdings had fractured. Every conversation seemed to stop when someone walked by. Clara sat at her desk with her hands folded in her lap, forcing herself not to glance toward Adrian's office every few seconds. She had done nothing wrong, yet she understood how fragile innocence could feel when powerful people were looking for answers. An hour passed, then another. Finally, Marcus emerged from the security room carrying a tablet. His expression gave nothing away as he entered Adrian's office and closed the door behind him. Through the frosted glass, Clara could see the shadow of Adrian standing while Marcus spoke. Daniel Mercer paced near the windows, checking his watch every few minutes. Evelyn remained perfectly still, though the tightness around her eyes had deepened. 10 minutes later, the office door opened. "Conference room," Adrian said. They gathered around the long walnut table, and Marcus connected the tablet to the wall screen. Grainy black and white footage appeared. The executive corridor at 7:12 a.m. The records cabinet sat at the far end of the hall. A figure approached, used a key card, opened the cabinet, removed a folder, and turned slightly toward the camera. Daniel's face appeared on the screen. The room went silent. Daniel stared at the image as if it belonged to someone else. "This is not what it looks like," he said immediately. Adrian did not speak. Marcus advanced the footage. Daniel carried the folder into a smaller records room, stayed inside for 4 minutes, and came back out without the folder. He looked down the corridor once, then walked toward the executive offices. The camera inside the records room is temporarily offline due to renovations, Marcus said. The file was not recovered from that room. Daniel's polished composure began to crack. I took the file to verify evaluation schedule. I was going to return it. Without informing anyone? Evelyn asked quietly. I did not think it required a formal report. Adrian's gaze was colder than Clara had ever seen it. You have worked with me for 8 years, he said. You know the protocol for signed acquisition documents. Daniel spread his hands. I made a judgment call. Clara looked at the paused footage again, and something bothered her. Daniel had entered the records room carrying the folder under his left arm. But when he exited, his suit jacket hung differently, as if something bulky had been placed inside it. She hesitated. This was not her investigation, but she remembered the detail that had made her question the cabinet in the first place. People in a hurry often overlooked small things. Mr. Romano, she said carefully. Adrian turned toward her. Look at the jacket. Everyone's attention shifted back to the screen. Clara stood and moved closer, pointing to the image. When he enters the room, the left side hangs straight. When he comes out, it pulls downward near the inside pocket. The folder is gone, but something is still there. Marcus replayed the clip twice. The difference was subtle, but once seen it was impossible to ignore. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Zoom in. The image became grainier, yet the outline of folded papers was visible beneath Daniel's jacket. Daniel's face drained of color. That could be anything. Then you will not mind if security checks the jacket, Adrian said. For the first time since Clara had met him, Daniel looked genuinely cornered. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin and strained. Marcus stepped forward, and after a long second Daniel removed the jacket himself. From the inside pocket, Marcus pulled a sealed envelope containing several pages from the Zurich acquisition file, including the valuation schedule and pricing terms. No one spoke. The silence felt enormous. Adrian looked from the documents to Daniel, and the disappointment in his expression was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. 8 years, he said quietly. Daniel swallowed hard. I was approached by another firm. They wanted to know whether the acquisition was overpriced. I was not selling the whole file. I just needed leverage for a compensation negotiation. You removed confidential documents to negotiate your salary? Adrian asked. Daniel looked down at the table and said nothing. Adrian turned away from him and looked at Clara instead. You saw what everyone else missed. Clara shook her head. I just looked twice. Their eyes held for a moment, and something shifted in the room. The suspicion that had surrounded her all morning evaporated, replaced by a different kind of attention. Adrian had spent years trusting a man who knew his business, his schedule, and his strategy. Clara had known him for 1 week and had just exposed the detail that unraveled the entire lie. As Marcus escorted Daniel out of the conference room, Adrian remained standing at the head of the table, his gaze still fixed on Clara. It appears, he said softly, that being consistent when nobody is watching is rarer than I thought. And for the first time, Clara saw the faintest crack in the walls Adrian Romano had built around himself. The executive floor felt different after Daniel Mercer left. Conversations resumed, phones started ringing again, and assistants returned to their desks, but an invisible tension still lingered in the air. 8 years of trust had collapsed in a single morning, and everyone had witnessed it. Clara spent the next few hours rescheduling meetings and updating the Zurich acquisition timeline as if it were an ordinary Friday. It was easier to focus on calendars and spreadsheets than on the fact that Adrian Romano had looked at her with something dangerously close to trust. By 6 o'clock, most of the floor had emptied. Evelyn stopped beside Clara's desk on her way out. You handled yourself well today, she said. Many people would have panicked. I was panicking, Clara admitted. Evelyn's sharp expression softened for a fraction of a second. The trick is learning which people need to see it and which do not. She glanced toward Adrian's closed office door. He asked me to send you in before you leave. Clara's pulse skipped. Did he say why? No. And with him, that usually means it matters. After Evelyn disappeared into the elevator, Clara gathered her notebook and walked to the office door. She knocked once. "Come in." Adrian was standing near the windows again, the city glowing behind him in gold and blue as evening settled over Manhattan. His tie was gone, and the top button of his shirt was undone, revealing the edge of the tattoo that disappeared beneath the fabric. A single desk lamp cast warm light across the room, making it feel less like a corporate office and more like a place where someone spent far too many nights alone. "You wanted to see me?" she asked. Adrian gestured toward the seating area instead of the desk. "Sit down." The request surprised her. Every previous conversation had taken place across the desk, with him in the position of authority and her in the position of employee. Now he sat in the chair opposite hers, close enough that she could see the faint shadows of exhaustion beneath his eyes. For a moment he said nothing, turning a glass of water slowly in his hands. "Daniel was my friend," he said finally. Clara had expected a discussion about security procedures or confidentiality agreements. This caught her completely off guard. "I am sorry," she said quietly. Adrian gave a short, humorless laugh. "That is the problem. Everyone says they are sorry after the damage is done." He looked down at the glass. "When my father was building this company, he trusted the wrong business partner. It nearly destroyed everything he had spent 20 years creating. After that, he taught me a simple rule. Trust no one with information you cannot survive losing." His voice remained calm, but Clara could hear the weight beneath it, the kind of lesson learned too young and carried for too long. "I was 22 when he died," Adrian continued. "Suddenly I was responsible for thousands of employees, investors, properties, negotiations. Every person who shook my hand seemed to want something from me. Some wanted money. Some wanted influence. Some just wanted proximity to power." He looked up then, and the intensity of his gaze made her sit a little straighter. "Do you know what I noticed about you during the investigation?" Clara shook her head. "You never tried to convince me you were innocent. I told you to check the footage." "Exactly. You trusted evidence more than persuasion." The room fell quiet again. Outside, rain had finally stopped, and the streets below reflected the city lights like dark water. Adrian set the glass down and leaned back, studying her with that same unreadable focus she had felt from the beginning. "Clara, I am going to ask you something unusual." Her fingers tightened slightly around the notebook in her lap. "All right. I want you to continue working directly for me, but I also want you involved in meetings that are normally above an executive assistant's level. Financial reviews, acquisition planning, internal audits. I need someone who notices the details other people ignore." Clara stared at him. "Mr. Romano, I do not even have a degree yet. You have judgment. Today proved that." She looked away for a second, trying to process what he was offering. "Why me?" Adrian was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he spoke, and his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Because when you walked into this office, you were the only person who did not seem interested in impressing me. And today, when you had every reason to protect yourself first, you still chose to follow the facts." Something warm and unsettling moved through Clara's chest. Adrian stood and walked toward the door, then stopped beside it without opening it. "One more thing," he said. She looked up. "You do not need to wait for permission every time you have a concern. If something feels wrong, I want you to tell me immediately." Clara nodded slowly. "I will." Adrian's hand rested on the door handle, but he did not open it yet. "Stay, Clara. I do not want you to leave this office thinking you are just another assistant who can be replaced next week." The words hung in the quiet room, simple and unguarded. For a man who measured every sentence, it sounded remarkably close to vulnerability, and Clara realized with sudden clarity that the most surprising thing was not that Adrian Romano was beginning to trust her. It was that he seemed afraid of losing the one person who had given him a reason to try. Monday morning, Clara arrived 10 minutes early and stopped in the hallway outside Adrian's office. For the first time since she had started working at Romano Holdings, the door was already open. Not just unlocked, but standing several inches ajar as if someone had intentionally left it that way. She could see the warm glow of the desk lamp and the silhouette of Adrian near the windows. One hand wrapped around a coffee mug while the city slowly woke beneath him. The sight made her pause. Evelyn appeared from the elevator carrying a stack of folders and noticed Clara standing there. "You can go in," she said softly. "He is expecting you." "The door is open," Clara replied before she could stop herself. Evelyn's eyebrows lifted. "That is new." Clara walked forward, her heels quiet against the carpet. She reached the doorway and knocked lightly anyway. Adrian turned from the windows. The morning light caught the sharp lines of his face, but the guarded expression she had first encountered weeks earlier had changed. The caution was still there. She suspected it always would be. Yet it no longer felt like a wall designed to keep her out. "You do not have to knock anymore," he said. The words were simple, almost casual, but Clara understood what they cost him. This was a man who kept his office locked, his schedules compartmentalized, and his trust rationed like a scarce resource. An open door was not a convenience. It was an invitation. She stepped inside, and Adrian handed her a second coffee mug. "I remembered how you take it," he said. Clara looked down in surprise. 1 sugar, a splash of milk, and no flavored syrup. Exactly the way she made it for herself. "You noticed. You notice everything else." It seemed fair. A small smile touched her lips as she accepted the mug. The gesture should have felt insignificant, yet it warmed something deep in her chest. For years she had been the person, remembering everyone else's preferences. Her mother's medication schedule, doctors' names, insurance claim numbers, grocery lists. She could not remember the last time someone had paid attention to a detail simply because it mattered to her. Adrian moved back toward the desk where a new stack of files waited. "I reviewed your university records over the weekend," he said. Clara blinked. "You investigated me?" "I verified information that affects my business." "There is a difference." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, taking the sting out of the statement. "Your grades in advanced accounting and forensic auditing were exceptional." "Forensic auditing was my favorite class." "I know." He picked up a folder and held it out to her. "Romano Holdings has a tuition reimbursement program that has not been used in 3 years. I would like you to use it." Clara stared at the folder without taking it. "Mr. Romano, I cannot afford to go back to school full-time. I am not asking you to. 1 class at a time, evenings or weekends. The company will cover the tuition, books, and fees." Her throat tightened unexpectedly. "Why would you do that?" Adrian's expression grew thoughtful. "Because talent should not be wasted because life became difficult at the wrong moment." He paused, then added more quietly. "And because someone once gave me an opportunity when I had not earned it yet." Clara accepted the folder with careful hands. Inside was a formal authorization form already signed by Adrian himself. She looked up at him, searching for the right words, but none of them felt large enough. "Thank you," she whispered. Adrian held her gaze for a long moment. "Do not thank me by being grateful. Thank me by finishing what you started." The office phone rang, breaking the moment. Clara set down her coffee, slipped naturally into her role, and began taking notes as Adrian answered a call from Zurich. The conversation moved through exchange rates, regulatory approvals, and revised timelines, but something had shifted between them. He no longer explained things as if she were temporary. He included her, asked for her input, and waited for her response. An hour later, after the call ended, Adrian looked over the updated schedule she had prepared. "You moved the investor briefing by 15 minutes, he said. "The Zurich team is 6 hours ahead. If we kept the original time, they would be presenting after business hours and we would get rushed answers." Adrian nodded once. "Good catch." He signed the revised agenda and handed it back to her without reviewing it line by line, a small act that carried enormous meaning. Clara realized he was trusting her work enough not to verify every detail himself. She turned toward the door, and Adrian spoke before she could leave. "Clara." She looked back. "Yes." His voice was calm, but there was a warmth in it she had never heard during that first accidental meeting. "I spent a long time believing trust was a weakness. You have made this office feel different." Clara felt her heartbeat stumble for just a second. Adrian glanced toward the open doorway and then back at her. "Leave it open," he said. She nodded and walked out to her desk, the morning light stretching across the executive floor. Behind her, the door remained open, and for the rest of the day employees passed by with subtle double takes, noticing the change without daring to comment on it. The most guarded man in the building had opened his office to someone else, and that single open door said more than any speech ever could. Adrian Romano still wore tailored suits, still carried the authority that made rooms fall silent, and still trusted very few people. But every morning after that, he looked up when Clara Bennett walked through the door, and for the first time in many years, he no longer looked like a man standing alone behind a locked wall. And that was how the coldest man in Manhattan discovered that trust does not arrive all at once. Sometimes it begins with a wrong elevator, a fresh cup of coffee, and a door left open for the one person who never asked for the key.